Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. To the Honorable, our lecturer, Sir Gatot, and all of my classmates. Today, my group will presenting material about qualitative research. And before we start the presentation, let me introduce myself and my group members. My name is Dea Arinda Salsabila, and my friends, Tengku Oktari Saryani Salsabila and Fatia Nur Ekarama. Alright, for the first material will be delivered by my friend Tengku Oktari Saryani Salsabila. Time and place is yours.
Alright there. So the first material is about what is phenomenological research. Phenomenology is an approach to qualitative research that focuses on the commonality of a lived experience within a particular group. The fundamental goal of the approach is to arrive at a description of the nature of the particular pronoun. Typically, interviews are conducted with a group of individuals who have first-hand knowledge of a given situation or experience. Alright, the next is steps of conducting the research. While conducting of a phenomenological research methodology, it often pertains the four necessary steps of 1. Bracketing. This is the process where preconceived belief and opinion concerning the phenomenon research are identified and held in advance. In this process, the researcher breaks out the surrounding and any presuppositions contained in a bid to confront the data in a very pure form. The second is intuiting. After bracketing out is done, intuition follows, where the researcher now remains focused on the attribute meaning of the phenomenon by the preceded research. Through the process, a shared understanding of a phenomenon on whatever being studied is achieved. The third is analyzing. After completing the intuition process, the analysis is the next step. In this process, coding is done where categorizing and making signs of the significant meanings of the phenomenon is created. And the last is describing. The critical step of any phenomenological research methodology is the description. In the descriptive stage, this is where comprehension and definition of the phenomenon are done by the researcher. The next is technique of collecting data and how. There are variety of methods of data collection in qualitative research, including observation, textual or visual analysis, and interview. However, the most common method used, particularly in healthcare research, are interview and focus group. There are many methods available for collecting data in phenomenological research. The gold standard for phenomenological data is the focus group or interview. The most common method is being the unstructured or semi-structured interview. Next is technique of data analysis. Step 1 is transcription. The first step after data collection is transcription of your semi-structured interview or journal or other qualitative data set. The data set provided with this paper consists of two of such transcripts from the immersion experience phenomenological study conducted by the first author. Step 2 is organizing the data. After transcription, you need to focus on organizing the data to make sense out of the volume of rich text. In other words, you are trying to develop the storyline by carefully reading and understanding the transcript or data sets. This process starts recording the dataset either manually or through software. Step 3 is coding. Coding is a way to systematically organize and understand the data. Codes are the basic elements of labeling and organizing the dataset. They are essential to link the data and to synthesize them into categories. Manual querying can be done using hard or soft copies of the data. The next is technique of drawing the conclusion. When writing the conclusion to your research, follow these general rules. First, state your conclusion in clear, simple language. Don't simply reiterate your results or the discussion. Indicate opportunities for future research as long as you haven't already done so in the discussion section of your paper. Consider the following points to help ensure your conclusion is appropriate. If the argument or point of your paper is complex, if prior to your conclusion you have not yet explained the significance of your findings, or if you are proceeding inductively, and move from a detailed to a general level of consideration that return the topic to the context provided by the introduction or within a new context that emerged from the data. Alright, now we move to the topic 2. It's about what is ethnographic research. So, ethnographic research is a qualitative method where researchers observe and or interact with a study's participants in their real-life environment. Ethnography was popularized by anthropology, but its use across a wide range of social science. The aim of an ethnographic study within a usability project is to get under the skin of a design problem. It's hoped that by achieving this, a designer will be able to truly understand the problem and therefore design a far better solution. The first is live and work, or naturalism. Also known as naturalism, live and work is an ethnographic research technique in which the researcher observe the research variable in their natural environment in order to identify and record behavioral patterns. Naturalistic observation can be disguised or indisguised. The live and work method allows the researcher to gather the most accurate and most relevant data as a result of observing the research subject in their natural environment. The second is participant observation. Participant observation is a data collection method in ethnographic research where the ethnographer gathers information by participating actively and interacting with the research subject. This method is quite similar to live and work techniques used. There are two types of participant observation, which are disguised participant observation and undisguised. Disguised participant observation is the ethnographer pretends to be a part of the research subject while hiding his or her true identity of being a researcher. And in undisguised, the ethnographer becomes a part of the group being observed and reveals his or her identity as a researcher to the group. The next is interview. An ethnographic interview is a qualitative research method that matches immersive observation with one-on-one discussion in order to arrive at the most authentic research outcome. In this research design, the ethnographer converses with members of the research group as they engage in different activities related to the research content. Survey. An ethnography survey is an inductive research method that is used to gather information about the research subject. This research design is also referred to as analytic induction, and it involves outlining hypotheses in the form of survey questions and administering these questions in the research environment. In order to gather the most relevant response using this, it's best to include different question types in your survey. High survey dollar rates and survey response bias are some of the major limitations of this research method. Archival research. Archival research is a qualitative approach to ethnographic research in which the researcher analyze existing research, document, and other sources of information about the research group in order to discover relevant information. This method can be also referred to as understanding. It allows the ethnographer to have access to a large repository of research data that results in more accurate findings. However, because archival research is often subject to randomization, its findings may not accurately reflect the research group. Alright, so the next is about step of conducting the research. The first is identify the core product idea. The first step revolves around identifying the core idea for your software product. Alright, so the next is about step of conducting the research. The first is identify the core product idea. The first step revolves around identifying the core idea for your software product. This will further help in identifying the target audience you are solving the problem for. The second is formulate the research question. For example, if you are building enterprise software for enabling their communication, the right survey question could be, why are you choosing of the self software for communication, or what software product are you using currently? The third is finalize research location. Now that you know who your target audience is and the question you would ask them, the next step is to figure out where you would have to conduct ethnographic research. Once you know the geography, it will be easy to determine where to conduct the ethnographic research. You can also choose to suit multiple research locations depending on the complexity of the core problem you are trying to solve. And the fourth is determine the ethnographic research type. There are three types of ethnographic research methods. There are passive observation. This is the researcher may take notes, click photograph, or record videos to draw observational inference. The second is a contextual interview. Following the subject and observing them doing their regular activities while also interacting with them. The third is archival research. The research digs down existing document and past research for understanding the requirement. There is no physical contact with the subject in the case of archival research. The fifth is seek approval. Alright, so after all the initial requirements are in place, the next step is to seek approval from concerned official. Once all the approval are in your hand, you can move ahead with the research process. The sixth is conduct ethnographic research. This is the part of the process where you are in the live environment of your target audience and observe them as they perform their daily tasks. You may conduct the research based on the chosen ethnographic method. The seventh is analyze the collected data. At this stage, the researcher will organize all the collected documents and the data for further analysis. And the final report should focus on observation made, behavior analysis, data analytic, ideas, suggestion, and challenges. And the last is create the requirement document. The last step is to document the requirement related to the UI or UX of the software product you are trying to build. Before creating the final requirement analysis document, it's imperative to create a POC or proof of concept and seek approval. The next material will conveyed by my friend. Dea Arlinda Salsabila, it's your time.
Next, alright, we will talk and discuss about the techniques of data analysis, especially in ethnographic research. Well, the analysis of data generally begins with the coding process and ends with interpretive assertions, and sometimes theory development within ethnographic writing. And the last is thematic analysis is a common method of data analysis for ethnographers and other qualitative field researchers. Data analysis is the process by which we make sense of all the data that we have collected over the course of a project, allowing the researcher to make some assertions about a particular social and cultural space. Next, we will discuss and talk about the technique of drawing the conclusion in ethnographic research. Conclusion drawing involves stepping back to consider what the analyzed data mean and to assess their implications for the questions at hand. Here, validity encompasses a much broader concern for whether the conclusions being drawn from the data are credible, defensible, warranted, and able to withstand alternative explanations. Well, one factor that can impede conclusion drawing in evaluation studies is that the theoretical or logical assumptions underlying the research are often left unstated. And recognizing these assumptions becomes even more important when there is a need or desire to place the findings from a single evaluation into wider comparative context face other program evaluations. Next, we move to the next topic, that is narrative research. What is narrative research? Narrative research aims to explore and conceptualize human experience as it is represented in textual form, aiming for an in-depth exploration of the meanings people assign to their experiences. Narrative researchers work with small samples of participants to obtain rich and free-ranging discourse. The emphasis is on storied experience. Generally, this takes the form of interviewing people around the topic of interest, but it might also involve the analysis of written documents. Next, we move to talk about the steps of conducting narrative research. The first step is code narrative blocks. Inductively code the narrative blocks you find in your interviews. You should code narrative blocks about similar life events with the same code. For example, stories about how someone decided to have children could be coded as narratives about deciding to have children. The next step, group and read by life event. Read over all the narratives that you coded with the same life event code. As you do, note their similarities and the differences. The next step is create nested story structure codes. For example, narratives about deciding to something. This can be your inductively created life event code. The abstract or these codes are based on story structure, the orientation, the complicating action, the evaluation, the resolution, and the last is the coda. The next step, delve into the story structure. Now you can collate each life event by its story structure code. For example, within narratives about deciding to have children, you can focus on orientation. You can compare and contrast how different research participants oriented their stories. The similarities and the differences can be written down as you observe them. Differences can be further coded to help with later analysis. For example, if it was common for your participants to talk about their parents' marital status, you may end up with the following code structure. Next is compare across story structure. As you break up your narrative blocks by story structure, don't lose sight of the overarching narrative. Switch between reading your narrative blocks as a whole and diving into each individual story structure code. You have to pay attention to how story structure codes relate across a live event. And the last step, tell the core narrative at the end of these steps. You will have fully explored each narrative block. You will have a deep understanding of how your research participants self-narrate their lives. Next, now we will talk about the techniques of collecting data and how, especially in narrative research. First, you have to defining the problem or question to be investigated. Researcher aim to describe, clarify, explain, or correct what has been conducted before. The next is locating relevant resources of historical information. Researcher can searching for relevant source materials. The next is summarizing and evaluating the information obtained from the sources. Researcher will summarize and evaluate the sources that they able to locate. And the last is presenting and interpreting his information. This means researcher interpret the evidence obtained and then drawing the conclusions about the problem or hypothesis. For the next material will be delivered by my friend Fatia Nur Eka Rahma. The time and place is yours. Alright, now I will deliver the material about techniques of data analysis in narrative research. The four generic methods applied in narrative research are: first, source criticism. Next is time series analysis. Next is the use of comparative methods. And the last is counterfactual analysis. These are all vital in constructing a proper process analysis of the internationalization of the firm. And in summary, narrative research methods approach provide a research designed for internationalization process studies that enhance the depth of understanding by incorporating concrete timelines, alternatives, and decision process. Alright, next slide. Now we will discuss the technique of drawing the conclusion in narrative research. As we know, a conclusion is not simply a summary of the findings and the research conducted. Importantly, the conclusion provides a significant and vital opportunity to explain to the reader exactly what the research means to the various audiences who have an interest in the research. Here are some important things in drawing the conclusion. First is what has been learned. Generally, a researcher will summarize what they believe has been learned from the research, and will try to assess the strength of the hypothesis. Even if the null hypothesis is accepted, a strong conclusion will analyze why the results were not as predicted. The next is generating leads for future research. However, very few experiments give clear-cut results, and most research uncovers more questions than answers. The researcher can use this to suggest interesting direction for further study. If, for example, the null hypothesis was accepted, there may still have been trends apparent within the results. The third is evaluating flaws in the research process. The researcher will then evaluate any apparent problems with the experiment. This involves critically evaluating any weaknesses and errors in the design, which may have influenced the results. Even strict, true experimental designs have to make compromises, and the researcher must be thorough in pointing this out, justifying the methodology and the reasoning. Next, the fourth is what are the benefits of the research? The next stage is to evaluate the advantages and benefits of the research. In some fields, certain kinds of research might not typically be seen as beneficial, regardless of the results obtained. Ideally, researchers will consider the implications of their research beforehand, as well as any ethical considerations. The next is suggestions based upon the conclusions. The final stage is the researcher's recommendations based on the results, depending on the field of the study. This area of the research process is informed by the researcher's judgment and will integrate previous studies. The area in a research paper that causes intense and heated debate among scientists is often when drawing conclusions. And the last is summary or the strength of the results. The key to drawing a valid conclusion is to ensure that the deductive and inductive processes are correctly used and that all steps of the scientific method were followed. Even the best planned research can go awry, however. Part of interpreting results also includes the researchers putting aside their ego to appraise what, if anything, went wrong. Next, now we will talk and discuss about the grounded theory research. First, what is grounded theory research? Well, grounded theory is a qualitative method that enables you to study a particular phenomenon or process and also discover new theories that are based on the collection and analysis of real-world data. The process of data collection, data analysis, and theory development happen in an iterative process. Iterative data collection and analysis occurs until you reach theoretical saturation, the point at which additional data adds no additional insight into your new theory. Next, now we will talk and discuss about the steps of conducting the research, especially in grounded theory research. Well, grounded theory is not a linear process where you collect data, analyze it, and then you're done. It is an iterative research methodology that involves cycling through the steps iteratively. Part of what made grounded theory revolutionary was that it mixed data collection with the analysis. It emphasized going back to the field even after conducting some analysis. You will recruit some participants, gather data and analyze it, and go back into the field again with a different recruiting strategy and focus of inquiry. Grounded theory is deliberately cyclical in nature. Well, the first step is determine initial research questions. Start off with your initial research questions. Have an idea for what phenomenon you are trying to explain. These initial questions will help guide you for your first steps in recruiting and data analysis, but know that the questions may evolve as you observe and learn more from the data you collect. Next is recruit and collect data using theoretical sampling. With grounded theory, recruiting participants is iterative. Instead of predetermining a specified recruiting criteria ahead of time, we'll practice what is called theoretical sampling. With theoretical sampling, you start with recruiting a small group of participants loosely based on your initial research questions. After you do some initial analysis of the data, which we detail in the following steps, you use what you learned from the analysis to determine who to require next. The third step is break up transcripts into excerpts using open coding. After you have collected some data, such as transcriptions from interviews, you can begin open coding. Open coding is when you take your transcripts and break it into individual excerpts. Then, take the excerpts and continuously compare and contrast them with other excerpts. Notice similarities and differences between the excerpts. The next steps is group quotes into The next step is group excerpts together into quotes using open coding. As you make comparisons between excerpts of data, look for sets of excerpts that represent the same central idea or concept and group them together. You can use a code to encapsulate these groups of excerpts, and codes are like tags or labels that are assigned to excerpt of text. The next is group codes into categories using axial coding. As you gradually develop a list of codes that bring together sets of excerpts, you should also begin to also compare codes with other codes. If you are using qualitative data analysis software, these categories are represented by a series of nested codes which are stacked in a hierarchy. The next is analyze more excerpts using constant comparative method. Remember, you have to remember that grounded theory is a cyclical process. Even after you have created lists of codes and grouped codes into categories, you should continue to analyze additional interview transcripts and compare the new excerpts to your existing coded categories. Well, as you make comparisons between your new excerpts to your codes and categories, your excerpt will generally do one of three things: contradict, expand upon, or support your existing codes and categories. Well, here's what you should consider in each scenario. The first is contradiction. If your new excerpt contradicts a code, this may be a sign that you need to adjust that code or change it. The next is expansion. If your new excerpt expands upon your code, either by adding more description or explaining more facts of your code, this is a good sign that you are continuing to learn more, and it means that you should continue to collect and analyze data until your new excerpts simply support your codes rather than expand upon them. And the last is support. If your new excerpt generally supports your code without adding additional information, this means that you may have reached theoretical saturation, which is the point at which more excerpts do not contribute any additional insight into your codes, and you can move on to a later stage of your research. The next step is continue collecting data and analyzing until you reach theoretical saturation. With these iterative steps, when do you know that you have analyzed enough? And how do you know when you should stop requesting or analyzing additional data? Well, with grounded theory, you want to continue until you reach the point where additional transcript excerpts don't expand upon your codes and categories. In other words, if you are learning the same thing over and over again, even with additional excerpts, that means that your codes and categories have become theoretically saturated. The excerpts you have collected so far address all relevant aspects of your codes and categories, and there is no need to pursue further data collection or analysis for your particular codes and categories. The next is define the core category of using selective coding. Once you feel you have reached theoretical saturation in your codes and categories so far, it is time to pull your findings together with selective coding. With selective coding, you connect all your codes and categories together under one core category. And the last is write your grounded theory. Once you have determined your core category through selective coding and are confident that you have reached theoretical saturation, it is time to construct your new theory. Gather together your code and series of memos and use them to describe your new theory. You can state your new theory in just a couple words or sentences. You can define the limits or boundary of your theory. And you can also write an accurate statement of what was studied and construct your theory in a form that other researchers can use. Well, that's all from me. And for the next material will be delivered by my friend Fatia Nur Eka Rahma. The time and place is yours.
All right, thank you so much for the opportunity that has been given to me. My name is Fatia Nureka Rahma. I will continue to explain about the technique of collecting data of grounded theory research. So, grounded theory commonly uses the following data collection methods. The first that is interviewing participants with open-ended questions. So, an open-ended interview is a way of gathering information from people. So, an interviewer asks a question of a participant who then answers those questions. The interview is considered open-ended because even though the question can be scripted, the interviewer usually doesn't know what the contents of the response will be. These interviews may have some question to gather basic factual data on participants such as age and gender, but usually the focus more on the participants' thoughts, feelings, experiences, knowledge, skills, ideas, and preference. And the second is about the participant observation or field work and or focus groups. So, the participant observation is the process enabling researchers to learn about the activities of the people under study in a natural setting through observing and participating in those activities. So, it provides the context for development of sampling guidelines and interview guides. And the last is study of artifacts and texts. So research artifact means that what we observe in our study is not usually persons. So instead of giving information about the process of variable, we are studying the research artifact or a typical occurrence that gives us information about the study design or the study method or the study team. Alright, we move to the next one. It's about the techniques of data analysis of grounded theory research. So there are four steps. The first step is coding the data. Coding is both the first and most crucial step between gathering data and developing a valid theory from the data. A code is a keyword or label used to identify the content of the data segment in order to make it easier to find it again later. Codes create order. Think of the library's keyword catalog. For example, catalogs help you to find the right book at the same time, provide an overview of the topics on which the library has books. Of course, how useful such a catalog is will depend on the usability of the index system and on the accuracy of this keyword site. The same is true for a researcher's coding work. So the second step is about customizing the code system. During later round of coding, the researcher goes through the data they have already coded again using the selective coding technique mentioned above. This process will help you create and refine what is called a code tree, which will allow you to easily identify codes with similar content and group them into a concept. And the third step is category building with creative coding. In grounded theory analysis, categories are created by grouping together similar concepts in the second half of a selective coding pass or third pass of coding, as is described by some experts. These categories will ultimately be the basis for the new theory structure because the researcher will be able to label the links between categories theoretically. When new codes are generated, sorted, and organized into the hierarchical code structure, the relationship between codes began to emerge. And the last step, or fourth step, is about constructing the theory. After the selective coding pass, the theoretical links between the categories will have become clearer. So the next step in grounded theory is the theoretical sampling pass, in which further select data is collected in order to develop the emerging theory and elaborate the main categories constituting it. And then the last technique of grounded theory is drawing the conclusion. So a conclusion is not simply a summary of the findings and the research conducted. Importantly, the conclusion provides a significant and vital opportunity to explain to the reader exactly what the research means to the various audience who have an interest in the research. The conclusion provides the potential to explore in depth and detail the broader implication of the findings while stating the limitation of the research and clearly delineating the parameters. Like all stages of participatory research, drawing conclusion and dissemination of research finding must adhere to the principle of participatory research. There are seven some important things that the first is knowledge transfers, and the second collaborative identification of communities of interest and key message, and the third is collaboration production of strategies, and the fourth is collaboration and elicitation of key research questions, and the fifth is collaboration elicitation of data, and sixth is collaborative analysis and interpretation of data, and the last is about the collaborative production of conclusions and the key implications. All right, we move to the next theory is action research. So an action research is a research approach that is used to generate an in-depth, multifaceted understanding of a complex issue in the real-life context. So it is an established research design that is used extensively in a wide variety of disciplines, particularly in the social science. The case study approach is particularly useful to employ when there is a need to obtain an in-depth appreciation of an issue, event, or a phenomenon of interest in its natural real-life context. Our aim in writing this piece is to provide insights into when to consider employing this approach and an overview of key methodological consideration in relation to the design, planning, analysis, interpretation, and reporting of case studies. Okay, next is we move to the steps of conducting an action research. The first steps that we can do is we can determine and define research question. So the first step in scientific research is to establish a firm research focus that the researcher can revert to throughout the study of a complex phenomenon or object. So the researcher established the focus of study by asking questions about the situation or problem being studied and determining a purpose for the study. The object of research in a study may often be a program or entity, a person, a group of people. And the investigator investigates the object of in-depth study using a variety of data collection methods to produce evidence that leads to the understanding of the case and answer the research question. The second step is we select cases and determine data collection and analyze techniques. So during the research design phase, the researcher determines which approaches will be used in the selection of single or multiple real-life cases or examined in depth, and which instruments and approaches of data collection will be used. When using multiple cases, each case is treated as unique. The conclusion of each case can then be used as information that contributes to the entire study. However, each case remains a single case. So the researcher must determine whether to study cases that are unique in some way or cases that are considered typical, and can also select cases to represent a variety of geographic regions, a variety of size parameters, or other parameters. And the third is about the preparation for data collection in the case study method. Because case study research generates a large amount of data from multiple sources, systematic organization of data is important to prevent the researcher from becoming overwhelmed by the amount of data and to prevent the researcher from losing sight of the original goal and question of the researcher. So prepared preparation assists in the handling of large amounts of data in a documented and systematic manner. So the researcher prepared databases to assess and categorizing, classification, storage, and retrieval of data analysis. And then the next step is collection of data in the field. So the researcher must collect and store multiple sources of evidence comprehensively and systematically in formats that can be referenced and classified so that convergent lines of inquiry and patterns can be discovered. So the researcher carefully observed the object of the case and identify causal factors associated with the observed phenomenon. The relegation of an arrangement with the object of study or in addition of question to interviews may be necessary as the study progresses. And the case study research is flexible, but when changes are made, they are documented systemically. And then we move to the next is evaluate and analyze data. The researcher examines the raw data using many interpretations to find links between the search object and the result which with reference to the original search question. Throughout the process of evaluation and analysis, the researcher remains open to new opportunities and insight. The case study method using multiple methods of data collection and analysis techniques over researchers the opportunity to triangulate data to strengthen the findings and conclusion of research. And then the next step is prepare the report. So the purpose of the written report is to portray a complex problem in a way that conveys an experience passed on to the reader. So the studies present the data in a very accessible way to public and can lead the reader to apply the experience to their own actual situation. And then we move to the techniques of collecting data of an action research. So the case studies use techniques such as personal interviews, direct observation, psychometric tests, and archival records to gather information. So they are used to explore the causation in order to find underlying principles. However, they cannot be generalized to the overall population as can experimental research, and they cannot provide predictive power as can correlation research. Rather, they can provide extensive information for the development of new hypotheses for future testing or about a rare or otherwise hard to study event or conditions. As such, they are often seen in clinical research where the treatment of a specific individual is monitored to determine what is effective. Okay, I will explain about the techniques of data analysis in the action research. There are four techniques. The first is create data repository. To be able to analyze the data from the case studies, it has to be in a format that allows for easy manipulation. A word processor only allows for crude manipulation of such data and therefore, as proposed, and the use of a database is considered more appropriate. However, to effectively use a database to manipulate the case study data, a schema must be developed for this data. And the second is forms created. Forms are a database feature that can be used to ensure the integrity of the data in the database is guaranteed. This is achieved by incorporating specific controls into a form specifying what data can and cannot be entered into a database. Most importantly, this process ensures there is consistency in the quality of data that is entered into a database. And the third is codes and coding. Once the forms have been created, the next step is for data entry to begin. This process requires the data to be organized and managed in some form by assigning text or labels to the data collected, and this process is often referred to as coding. And the last technique is about analyzing the coded data. After the data entry and complete and the codes have been rationalized, the case study data can now be more closely analyzed. The nature of any relation database design is that it assists in analysis process because the designer of a database has already considered theoretical outputs from the database. Alright, the last is about the techniques of drawing the conclusion of action research. So there are four steps in drawing conclusion. The first is review all the information stated about the person, setting, or event. And the second is look for any facts or details that are not stated but inferred. And the third is analyze the information and decide on the next logical step or assumption. And the last is the reader comes up with a conclusion based on the situation. To draw a conclusion from evidence, look closely at the data or evidence presented and consider carefully how the evidence was obtained. For example, how an experiment or a study was conducted. The data and other evidence along with the question and answer choice lead you to the conclusion.
Alright, well, that was the end from our presentation. I would like to say thank you for everyone in this meeting, for the audiences who have listened to the results of our presentation, also to our lecturer, Sir Gatot, who has given us the opportunity to present the results of our work. So that's all from my group. Thank you everyone. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.